Next, we can talk about our second line of defense. So we worry about the second line of defense if our first line of defense has been breached. So the second line of defense is also considered as part of the innate immune system. It is nonspecific and it is present from birth. And generally, when we talk about the second line of defense, we're talking about specific types of cells that are involved. And what we're seeing in these images here is how you might need to begin to use your second line of defense. Here they're illustrating there's been some tissue damage, perhaps a needle stick or a cut, and bacteria have been introduced through the epidermis into the dermis. And you notice there's blood vessels in here, there's connective tissues, etc. Some of the first things that we see happen are because of the damage to cells, you get the release of a lot of different chemicals. And the names of all of those chemicals aren't terribly important for this class, but they basically cause pain, swelling, redness, and recruitment of other cells. The body will also try to form a blood clot. This will sometimes appear as a scab. Your body uses things called platelets to stop bleeding. And if there is an infection, oftentimes you'll start to get a pocket of infection. So you'll have a localized area of infection that is called an abscess. But what starts happening within the blood vessels is a lot of these chemicals that have been released here in step 1 recruit some of those phagocytic cells we talked about in the earlier part of the video. Those phagocytic cells respond to those chemicals, travel through the blood vessel to the site of infection, and actually squeeze their way out of the blood vessel into the area where there's an infection. So if you've ever had an infection, you might notice the production of pus. And pus consists of, yes, the dead bacteria, but also those white blood cells that have come to help fight that infection. And our second line of defense, again, has many functions. We have cells like phagocytes that come and engulf pathogens to destroy them. They also will continue to secrete chemicals to cause inflammation. So inflammation sounds like it's bad, but that swelling is usually caused by fluid. Because these cells are leaving the blood vessels, you get that fluid to kind of get into that tissue area. Redness is because when these white blood cells come out, sometimes red blood cells sneak out with them. Pain, it happens because there are nerves in the area and they're being activated by what's going on. And you might experience heat, like a localized increase in temperature. And again, that's because of these chemicals that are being produced. And sometimes that's really helpful because microorganisms don't always do well at higher temperatures. So inflammation might be painful and irritating, but it's actually serving an important purpose. Some of the cells, especially some of these phagocytic cells, like these macrophages that are shown here, will interact to help stimulate the third line of defense that we'll talk about a little bit later. And this scientist here, Dr. Metchnikoff, he won the Nobel Prize because he described the role of how these white blood cells, these phagocytic cells, help to fight infection. He discovered them in human blood. And so now we can see things like phagocytic cells and how they can actually engulf microorganisms. And this is a pretty big one. This is a yeast. It's a type of fungus. They're much bigger than bacterium. And you can see this phagocytic cell, this cell of ours, is able to engulf it and eventually destroy it. So again, inflammation is the redness, swelling, pain, and heat at that site of infection. And it's irritating. It's painful. Right? You're swollen, but that is what helps to attract cells to the area that can help clean up any potential infection. The other thing that those cells can do when there is tissue damage and that inflammation is It can help to limit tissue damage, get rid of damaged cells and pathogens. So when you have a cut, sure, it can introduce an infection, but that cut also destroys some of your own cells. So having your immune system come in and help clean it up is really important. If you, let's say I don't know, if you like to watch those home improvement TV shows, and somebody wants a new kitchen. Well, you destroy the old kitchen, right? So you can put in the new kitchen, but you don't just leave all the old kitchen material around. You clean it up so you can build a new one. Or, when a tornado goes through, or an earthquake, or a flood, you remove the damage so you can repair and make it like new. And so that's what that inflammatory response will do as well. Get rid of infection. Say you got mold after flooding, so we'll get rid of the mold, but we also have to clean up the destroyed drywall, the floor, the carpet, whatever. So we clean up and we get rid of infection. Now, the challenge is that sometimes inflammation just kind of generally responds to an area, and we can get damage to healthy tissue as well. And again, you could think of it as, if you're going to repair the drywall, maybe only a couple of feet of drywall at the bottom were messed up, but you actually have to go a little bit higher. You want to make sure that you really got rid of it, or maybe you're a little bit sloppy and you just end up having to replace the whole panel. So sometimes you do get damage to healthy tissue. Now, this usually works pretty well. I imagine that most of you have had lots of infections. Sometimes you probably didn't even know, but maybe you did know. You're like, ooh, I have a little infection, and then it went away. Not a problem. Every once in a while, in some people, that infection can spread from the local site. Let's say you got a cut on your finger, and for whatever reason, your second line of defense wasn't able to keep the pathogen at your finger to clean it up. And that bacterium got all the way into your body. That can lead to a process called septic shock. And that can be life-threatening. So a little cut on your finger could eventually kill you. And what happens here, a lot of the times with that septic shock, so specifically that shock, is you start to get that inflammation all over the body. The whole body is now experiencing fever, cell migration. And when you have that, you have the cells leaving the blood vessels, so you can get bleeding throughout the body. That can lead to death in up to 30% of individuals. And that, of course, is more dangerous than the initial infection. So sometimes if the immune system, I don't want to say fails, but is not able to contain the infection, it then reacts all over the whole body. It reacts systemically, and that can cause a really big problem. And there are some bacteria that can actually induce that shock phenomenon on their own. They don't even have to be spread throughout the body. They produce a toxin that will, let's say you have an infection in your finger. They produce a toxin in your finger. That toxin gets into your body and can cause those same symptoms. And those proteins or toxins they produce that do this are called super antigens. They are super stimulators of the immune system. In fact, they can activate up to 20% of the T cells in your body. And we'll talk about T cells when we talk about our third line of defense. This leads to a process called a cytokine storm. So basically all of those little chemicals that cause fever, that cause cell migration, that cause pain, those are active all over your whole body. That's the cytokine storm. And that, again, can kill people. Those of you who have ever purchased tampons, especially those of you who use them, might have heard of something called toxic shock syndrome that was associated first with superabsorbent tampon usage in the 1970s. And what happens is, especially before plastic applicators, but even after, if you were handling the tampon bacteria from your skin, a common bacterium on your skin is Staphylococcus aureus or Staph aureus. Can get on the surface of the tampon, or as you're inserting it, you have that bacterium on the skin. It can go in with the tampon into the vagina. And even though they're cotton tampons and soft, they can cause microabrasions in the vaginal canal. And if those bacteria are replicating on the tampon and producing their toxin, that toxin can get in through those microabrasions and cause toxic shock syndrome. So currently, we see anywhere from 1 to 17 cases for every 100,000 people who are using tampons per year. But that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is, and it's actually more than we used to see in the past. And the increase is thought to be because of earlier onset of menstruation. Younger people maybe just aren't as self-aware, aren't as able to, take care of themselves as well. But also high absorbent tampons, you would leave them in longer, right? So they're more convenient because you change them less frequently. But, right, they also could be in there too long and harbor too many bacteria. So the recommendation for anyone who uses a tampon is to wash your hands, of course, before you change your tampon, but also to change them every, 4 to 5 hours. It depends on the brand. Look at the box. Don't leave them in too long. They say don't even leave them in overnight. But, that's up to you. Toxic shock syndrome is not only associated with tampon use, it's also associated with lots of these infections. Again, streptococcus, staphylococcus. So even something like strep throat could eventually lead to toxic shock syndrome. And so toxic shock syndrome was actually the cause of death of a very famous man in 1990, at least famous to me because I was a kid in 1990, and his works meant a lot to me. Jim Henson, the creator of the Muppets, so like Sesame Street and all of those Muppet-associated television shows and movies, died of toxic shock syndrome caused by streptococcus in 1990. And he worked closely with Disney. And so the Disney animators, when Jim Henson died, drew Mickey Mouse consoling Kermit the Frog because Kermit was sad that Jim Henson had died. So it doesn't discriminate. You could be rich, you could be poor, you could be famous, you could be not. And that type of infection, with the overwhelming reaction of the immune system, can kill you.